Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into something a little different. The brutal, unvarnished reality of what it meant to survive World War II as an ordinary soldier. Not the Hollywood version, not the sanitized textbook accounts, but the real deal. The kind of story that starts with some poor kid thinking war might be an adventure, and ends with a man who's learned that surviving hell is just the beginning. So before we get into this, hit that like button if you're ready for some uncomfortable truths, and subscribe if you want more stories that don't pull punches. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's always wild to see how far these stories travel. Now settle in. Maybe grab something warm to drink, because we're about to spend the next while walking through a life that was shaped by mud, blood, and the kind of courage that only comes from having no other choice. This isn't going to be easy, but it's going to be real. Let's begin. So you think you know what war looks like? Think again. You've seen the movies, the clean heroics, the dramatic speeches before charging into battle, with perfectly styled hair and teeth that somehow stay white despite months of eating nothing but tinned beef and cigarette ash. Real war isn't a movie. Real war is waking up in a muddy hole somewhere in France, your boots full of trench foot and regret, wondering if the thing crawling on your leg is a rat or your last remaining nerve finally giving up. Before you could even dream of getting your guts blown out in some godforsaken European field, you had to survive the recruitment office. America's version of a cattle auction, except the cattle had dreams and the buyers had clipboards. You walked in thinking you'd impress them with your high school football stories and walked out property of Uncle Sam. Serial number tattooed into your soul along with your dog tags. Step 1. Present yourself to the recruitment sergeant. Shirt off. Dignity somewhere on the floor with your civilian clothes. The sergeant had seen 1,000 chests and wasn't impressed by yours either. He checked your teeth, not because he cared about your dental hygiene, but because dead soldiers with bad teeth cost more to bury. Flat feet, rejected, unless they needed cannon fodder that particular Tuesday. Bad eyes, rejected, unless you could hold a rifle without shooting your own foot. Visible signs of intelligence. Suspicious, but they'd take you anyway and beat it out of you during basic training. Height mattered, but not the way you thought. Too tall, and you made a better target. Too short, and you couldn't see over your rifle. The perfect soldier was medium everything. Medium height, medium build, medium intelligence. Just smart enough to follow orders. Just dumb enough not to question them. If you made it past the physical, congratulations, you were now considered prime meat for the grinder. The oath wasn't to America, not really. It was to the guy next to you, who smelled like wet wool and fear, and to the sergeant who looked like he'd been carved out of granite and cigarette smoke. This oath was taken seriously because breaking it didn't just mean court-martial. It meant letting down the poor bastard in the foxhole beside you when the mortars started falling like deadly rain. Still want to play soldier? Good. Sign your name on a line that might as well have read, "Bond and hope all ye who enter here." Trade your civilian identity for a uniform that fit like a burlap sack filled with disappointment. And prepare for the next few years of your life to be measured not in days or months, but in moments between explosions. They called it serving your country. Young men lined up around the block for it. Some were even excited. Adventure, they said. Glory, they said. Most of them had never seen what a mortar round does to human flesh, had never smelled the particular combination of gunpowder, blood, and bowel movements that becomes the cologne of combat. They thought war was cowboys and Indians with better uniforms. Basic training was where they took whatever remained of your civilian self and fed it through a meat grinder, operated by men who had forgotten what sleep felt like. Wake up at 0500, not because the sun was rising, but because some sadistic drill instructor decided your dreams were a luxury you couldn't afford. Physical training, until your muscles screamed for mercy, they weren't going to get. Rifle training until you could field strip your weapon blindfolded, in the dark, while someone screamed insults at your mother. You learned to march in formation, not because it looked pretty, but because when the shooting started, the only thing between you and complete chaos was the muscle memory of following the man in front of you. You learned to dig foxholes, not as an intellectual exercise, but because a hole in the ground might be the difference between coming home with stories and coming home in a box. The drill instructors weren't there to be your friends. They were there to break you down into component parts and rebuild you into something that could kill another human being without hesitation, follow orders without thinking, and march toward machine gun nests because someone with more stripes told you to. They called you maggot, not as an insult, but as a statement of fact. You were something that fed on death, and they were going to teach you to be very, very good at it. Forget your name. You weren't Bobby from Ohio or Mike from Brooklyn anymore. You were your serial number, and the last 4 digits tattooed on everything you owned. Your new identity came wrapped in olive drab wool that itched like hell and boots that were designed by someone who clearly hated feet. Everyone looked the same, marched the same, bled the same. Want to express individuality? Try not dying in a way that's slightly different from everyone else. Your bunkmates became your new family, whether you liked it or not. 40 men crammed into a barracks designed for 30, snoring, farting, and sharing diseases with the enthusiasm of kindergartners. If one got sick, you all got sick. If one screwed up, you all paid for it with push-ups until your arms fell off. The military didn't believe in individual punishment. They believed in collective suffering as a bonding experience. Then came the weapons training. The M1 Garand became your best friend. Your security blanket, your life insurance policy all rolled into one 8-pound piece of wood and steel. You learned to clean it, maintain it, and shoot it with the dedication of a monk tending his garden. Because unlike a garden, if your rifle jammed at the wrong moment, you didn't just lose the vegetables. You lost everything. They taught you to use bayonets, not because ammunition was scarce, but because sometimes war got personal. Close enough to see the color of the other guy's eyes, close enough to smell his last meal, close enough to have nightmares about his face for the rest of your natural life. Hand-to-hand combat training, where you learned that the Marquess of Queensberry rules didn't apply when someone was trying to kill you with a shovel. Grenade training was particularly fun. Here's a pineapple-shaped piece of metal filled with explosives. Pull this pin, throw it at the bad guys, and pray you don't trip and blow yourself up like some cosmic joke. The instructors made it look easy. Real combat made everything look impossible. Map reading, radio operation. First aid that consisted mainly of apply, pressure and pray. They taught you enough medicine to keep someone alive long enough for the real medics to arrive. Assuming the real medics weren't already dead or pinned down by sniper fire. Then came the specialized training. Some poor bastards got selected for paratrooper school, where they learned that jumping out of a perfectly good airplane was considered a viable military strategy. Others went to tank school, where they discovered that climbing inside a steel coffin and driving it toward enemy guns was someone's idea of tactical brilliance. The smart ones, or maybe the unlucky ones, ended up in intelligence, where they learned that military intelligence was the ultimate oxymoron. Radio operators learned that being the guy with the big antenna made you a particularly attractive target. Medics learned that the Geneva Convention was more of a suggestion than a law, especially when someone was shooting at the Red Cross on your helmet. Eventually, basic training ended. Not because you were ready, but because there was a war going on, and they needed bodies to feed into it. You got a brief leave, just long enough to go home and realize you didn't fit anymore. Your old friends seemed impossibly young. Your old concerns impossibly trivial. You'd been rebuilt into something that could function in hell, which made normal life feel like visiting an alien planet. Your family looked at you differently. Not with pride, exactly, but with a kind of nervous recognition that you weren't the same person who left. You weren't. The boy who'd walked into the recruitment office was gone, replaced by something harder, colder, more practical about the realities of human mortality. Then came the shipping out. Trains packed with soldiers, all trying to pretend they weren't scared, all failing spectacularly. The trip to the port, where Liberty ships waited like floating steel coffins to carry you across an ocean that didn't care whether you lived or died. Seasickness became a way of life. Men who'd never seen the ocean beyond postcards spent weeks puking their guts out while Nazi U boats played submarine tag with convoys. The Atlantic crossing was its own special kind of hell. Packed below decks like sardines, sharing the same air, the same diseases, the same nightmares about torpedo explosions. Some ships made it across. Others became underwater monuments to the idea that war doesn't distinguish between the good guys and the bad guys when it comes to drowning. But let's say you made it across. Congratulations, you survived the boat ride. Now came the real fun. Welcome to the European theatre of operations, where the theatres were bombed out buildings, and the only performance was staying alive long enough to see tomorrow. Your first taste of combat wasn't glorious. It was terrifying, confusing, and wet. Everything was always wet. Rain, mud, blood, piss, tears. The romantic notion of war, as some kind of noble enterprise, died about 30 seconds after the first artillery shell landed close enough to make your ears ring for a week. You learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. Courage was being absolutely terrified and doing the job anyway, because the alternative was letting down the guys who depended on you. You learned that heroes were mostly just regular people who found themselves in impossible situations and somehow didn't die. The Germans, it turned out, were very good at war. They'd been practicing longer, had better equipment, and were fighting for their homeland. You were fighting for ideas like freedom and democracy, which were hard to remember when machine gun bullets were chewing up the dirt around your foxhole. Combat became a routine of terror punctuated by moments of boredom. Dig in, wait, get shelled, advance a few hundred yards, dig in again. Repeat until someone decided you'd taken enough casualties to warrant pulling back, or until you ran out of ground to take. Maps meant nothing when every landmark had been blown to pieces. Coordinates were suggestions when artillery had rearranged the landscape into moonscapes of craters and rubble. You learned to recognize the different sounds of incoming death. Mortars had a distinctive whistle. Artillery shells screamed like banshees. Machine gun bullets made a crack when they passed close enough to part your hair. Each sound meant you had a different amount of time to find cover, pray, or write mental letters to people you'd never see again. Sleep became a luxury measured in minutes. You learned to doze while walking, to nap during artillery barrages, to dream while awake and stay alert while unconscious. Your body adapted to running on adrenaline, caffeine from terrible coffee, and cigarettes that tasted like burning cardboard, but helped calm nerves that had been frayed past the point of repair. Food was fuel, nothing more. Rations designed by people who'd clearly never tasted food, heated over tiny stoves that barely worked and attracted enemy fire like beacons. You ate whatever you could get, whenever you could get it, because you never knew when the next meal was coming. Hunger became background noise, like the constant sound of distant gunfire. The cold was worse than the hunger. European winters didn't care about your war. Snow and mud became your constant companions, seeping through every layer of clothing, every attempt at warmth. Frostbite took more soldiers out of action than German bullets some days. You learned to sleep in shifts, huddling together for warmth like particularly lethal puppies. Your equipment became an extension of your body. Rifle, ammunition, entrenching tool, first aid kit, personal items reduced to whatever fit in your pockets and wouldn't get you killed if you had to run. Everything else was excess weight that could slow you down when speed meant survival. Letters from home became lifelines to a world that seemed increasingly fictional. News about baseball scores and movie premieres from a place where people worried about ration stamps instead of mortar rounds. You wrote back when you could, editing out everything that would give your family nightmares, leaving behind sanitized versions of hell that made war sound like an uncomfortable camping trip. The buddy system wasn't military policy, it was survival. You paired up with someone whose breathing you learned to recognize in the dark, whose movements became as familiar as your own. You shared everything: ammunition, food, cigarettes, fear, hope. When your buddy caught one, part of you died with him. When you got a new buddy, part of you stayed dead to protect what was left. Medics were saints and madmen rolled into one. They ran toward gunfire to drag wounded men to safety, patched up holes in human beings with whatever they had available, and performed miracles with morphine and bandages. They saw more death before breakfast than most people see in a lifetime, and somehow kept their sanity long enough to keep saving lives. Officers ranged from competent leaders, who earned your respect, to incompetent martinets, who earned your hatred. The good ones led from the front, and cared more about bringing their men home alive than about following orders that made no tactical sense. The bad ones stayed in the rear and made decisions based on maps that bore no resemblance to the reality on the ground. You learned to navigate by destroyed landmarks. The bombed church, the burned-out tank, the pile of rubble that used to be someone's home. Cities became reference points between areas of concentrated death. Names like Normandy, Ardennes, and Rhine became more than geography lessons. They became scars on your memory. The breakthrough moments came when you least expected them. A German position that had held up your advance for weeks suddenly crumbling. Enemy soldiers appearing with white flags, looking as tired and scared as you felt. The realization that they were just kids too, wearing different uniforms but sharing the same desire to go home alive. Prisoners of war were a complication nobody prepared you for. Enemy soldiers who surrendered became your responsibility. You had to guard them, feed them, and resist the urge to settle personal scores for dead friends. The Geneva Convention was a nice idea that became harder to remember after you'd seen what artillery did to your squad leader. Liberation of concentration camps was something they couldn't have prepared you for if they'd tried. The smell hit you first, a combination of death, disease, and human suffering that no amount of combat experience could have readied you for. The survivors looked like skeletons wrapped in skin, living proof that human beings were capable of evil that transcended anything you'd seen in combat. These camps changed you in ways that combat couldn't. Combat was about survival, about you versus them, about doing your job and going home. The camps were about something else entirely. They were about what happened when civilization broke down completely, when human beings were reduced to numbers and processed like industrial waste. You realized you weren't just fighting for freedom or democracy or any of the high-minded ideals they'd talked about in training. You were fighting against something that had to be stopped, regardless of the cost. The war stopped being about following orders and started being about preventing the thing you'd seen from ever happening again. The German surrender came not with fanfare, but with exhaustion. Enemy soldiers who'd been trying to kill you yesterday became refugees trying to avoid the Russians. The war in Europe was over, but you weren't going home. Japan was still fighting, and you were experienced infantry. The Pacific theater beckoned with promises of different kinds of hell. But then the atomic bombs fell, and suddenly the war was over everywhere. Japan surrendered, and you found yourself in occupied territory, part of an army with nothing left to occupy, except time until shipping schedules could get you home. Occupation duty was its own kind of war. Not against bullets and artillery, but against boredom, drinking, and the slow realization that you didn't know how to be anything except a soldier. You'd been trained to kill people and break things, skills that didn't translate well to peacetime employment. The Germans you were supposed to be watching were often more afraid of the Russians than they were of you. Former enemies became sources of information. Guides through cities you'd helped destroy. Reminders that war made enemies out of people who might have been friends under different circumstances. You started hearing about something called battle fatigue, shell shock, combat neurosis. Clinical terms for the way your hands shook when it got too quiet. The way loud noises made you hit the ground. The way you woke up screaming from dreams about faces you'd seen through rifle sights. Some guys handled it better than others. Some drank themselves into oblivion. Some found religion. Some found ways to channel their training into peacetime jobs. Some never found anything at all and just drifted through life like ghosts haunting their own bodies. The trip home was supposed to be triumphant. Victory ships packed with heroes returning to ticker, tape parades and grateful nations. Reality was more complicated. You were coming home to a country that had moved on without you, to jobs that had been filled by people who'd stayed behind, to families who'd learned to live without you. The homecoming was awkward. People wanted to hear war stories, but they wanted the sanitized versions. The heroic versions, the versions that made sense and had clear good guys and bad guys. They didn't want to hear about the smell of burned flesh, the weight of a dead friend, the way enemy soldiers looked when they died. So you learned to edit your experiences, to tell the stories people wanted to hear, while keeping the real stories locked away where they couldn't contaminate normal life. You learned to smile when people thanked you for your service, even though part of you wondered what exactly they were thanking you for. Civilian life was harder than combat in some ways. In combat, the rules were simple: stay alive, complete the mission, take care of your buddies. Civilian life had complicated rules about mortgages and job interviews and social niceties that seemed impossibly trivial after you'd seen cities reduced to rubble. You got a job, maybe used the GI Bill to go to college, tried to build the life you'd dreamed about during those long nights in foxholes. But part of you remained in those holes, listening for incoming artillery, watching for muzzle flashes, ready to hit the ground when car backfires sounded too much like rifle shots. The nightmares came irregularly but reliably. Sometimes months would pass without incident, and you'd think you were finally past it. Then something would trigger a memory, and you'd be back in the mud, watching friends die, making decisions that kept you alive but cost you pieces of your soul. You found other veterans, men who understood without explanation, who could share a look across a crowded room and know exactly what the other was thinking. You formed informal networks of people who'd been through the same grinder and come out the other side, scarred but functional. Marriage was complicated. How do you explain to someone who's never been in combat why loud noises make you duck? Why you always sit with your back to the wall? Why you check exits before you sit down? How do you share a bed with someone when sleep brings dreams of burning tanks and screaming wounded? Some marriages survived, others didn't. The divorce rate among veterans was higher than anyone wanted to admit, evidence that some wounds don't heal just because the shooting stops. Love was supposed to conquer all, but love hadn't been in those foxholes, hadn't seen what you'd seen, hadn't done what you'd had to do. Children were a different kind of miracle and terror. You wanted to protect them from everything, to give them the childhood you'd lost somewhere between basic training and your first firefight. But protection meant vigilance, and vigilance meant never quite relaxing, never quite trusting that the world was safe. You found yourself studying your children's faces, memorizing them the way you'd memorized the faces of your squad, as if preparation for loss could somehow prevent it. You taught them to be careful, maybe too careful, because you knew how quickly everything could change. The Korean War came, and suddenly they needed experienced infantry again. Some of your buddies went back, drawn by familiar rhythms of military life, or pushed by civilian lives that never quite fit. You thought about it, wrestled with the pull of the only life you'd ever really understood, but ultimately stayed home. Watching the news from Korea was torture. You knew what those frozen hills looked like, could smell the cordite and fear through the television screen. Part of you felt guilty for not being there, for letting other people's kids fight a war you understood better than they did. The Cold War settled in like a permanent fog, a reminder that the peace you'd fought for was only temporary, that somewhere across oceans, other young men were preparing for wars that might make World War II look like a practice session. Nuclear weapons made everything both more urgent and more pointless. The next war might be the last war. You aged, but part of you remained frozen at whatever age you'd been when the shooting stopped. 20, 1 or 22, young enough to believe you were immortal, old enough to know better. The man in the mirror got older, but the soldier in your memories stayed young forever, locked in amber made of cordite and mud. Retirement came, eventually. Gold watches and pension plans, and time to think about everything you'd spent decades trying not to think about. The nightmares didn't retire. The startle reflex didn't take a pension. The ability to hit the ground when backfires sounded like gunshots remained as sharp as it had been in 1945. You started talking to historians, to writers, to documentarians who wanted to preserve the stories before all the storytellers died. You found yourself able to talk about things you'd never been able to discuss with family, as if the passage of time had made the memories safe enough to share. Some stories you never told. Some memories you took to the grave because they were too personal, too painful, or too complicated for anyone who hadn't been there to understand. The worst of it, the best of it. The moments that defined you stayed locked away where they belonged. Medical advances gave names to things you'd lived with for decades. Post-traumatic stress disorder replaced shell shock, making it sound more scientific and somehow more legitimate. Therapy helped some. Medication helped others. Time helped most of all, not by healing the wounds, but by making them familiar enough to live with. You watched your children grow up, have children of their own, build lives in a world that was safer because of what you'd done, even if they never quite understood what that was. You watched America change, sometimes for the better, sometimes not, but always with the knowledge that change was better than the alternative you'd seen in those camps. The country moved on, as countries do. New wars, new enemies, new generations of young men and women who thought they knew what they were getting into. You wanted to tell them, to warn them, to somehow pass on the wisdom you'd gained at such terrible cost. But some things can only be learned the hard way. World War II became history, then ancient history, then something studied by people who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. The veterans' organizations got smaller each year as biology took what combat had spared. You became a living monument to something that was already fading into legend. The young soldiers in new wars looked impossibly young, the way you probably looked to the veterans of the First War. You wanted to tell them that courage wasn't the absence of fear, that heroism was mostly accidental, that the most important thing was taking care of each other. But they had to learn it for themselves, the way you had. You realized, eventually, that you'd been changed by the war in ways that went deeper than trauma or adjustment disorders. You'd been shaped by the experience of seeing humanity at its worst and best, often in the same moment. You'd learned that people were capable of incredible evil and incredible good, sometimes by the same person on the same day. The war had taught you that life was precious because it was fragile, that peace was valuable because it was temporary, that freedom meant something because you'd seen what the world looked like without it. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. They were things you'd fought for, bled for, watched friends die for. In quiet moments, usually late at night, when the world was still enough to think, you wondered if it had been worth it. All the death, all the suffering, all the years of nightmares and adjustment problems, and relationships that never quite worked. Then you'd remember the camps. Remember the faces of the people you'd helped liberate. Remember the world your grandchildren inherited, because you'd been there when they needed you. The answer was always yes. Not because war was good or heroic or glorious. War was terrible, stupid, and wasteful. But sometimes terrible things had to be done to prevent worse things from happening. Sometimes young men had to go to hell so that the world didn't have to live there permanently. You'd been part of something larger than yourself. Something that mattered in ways that transcended individual survival or personal glory. You'd helped stop something that couldn't be allowed to continue. You'd paid the price for freedom with pieces of your soul, and somehow, despite everything, that trade had been worth making. The war had ended more than half a century ago, but it never really ended for you. It lived in the dreams that still came sometimes, in the reflexes that never quite went away, in the knowledge that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when everything they cared about was at stake. You'd survived not just the war, but the peace that followed. You'd built a life, raised a family, contributed to a world that was better, because you'd been willing to sacrifice for it. You'd learned to live with the memories, the scars, the knowledge of what human beings were capable of doing to each other. Most importantly, you'd learned to live with yourself, with the choices you'd made, the things you'd done, the people you'd failed to save. You'd learned that forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, was the hardest kind of courage. That coming home from war wasn't just about geography. It was about finding a way to live with honor in a world that often seemed to have forgotten what honor meant. The war had made you old before your time, but it had also given you a kind of wisdom that couldn't be gained any other way. You understood that life was short, that love was rare, that freedom was fragile, and that the price of all good things was eternal vigilance by people willing to pay it. You'd been one of those people. You'd paid that price. You'd earned the right to grow old in a free country, surrounded by people who could afford to take freedom for granted, because you'd helped make sure they'd never have to fight for it themselves. It wasn't the life you'd planned when you walked into that recruitment office so many years ago. It was harder, more complicated, more painful than anything you could have imagined. But it was yours, earned through hardship and sacrifice, and the kind of courage that only comes from having no other choice. You'd survived the brutal life of a World War II soldier, and in surviving, you'd helped create a world where other people didn't have to. The reunions came later, when enough time had passed to make the memories bearable enough to share with strangers. Hotel ballrooms full of old men comparing scars and remembering friends who never made it home. These gatherings were equal parts celebration and wake, toasting the living while honoring the dead. You'd sit around tables with men you hadn't seen in decades, amazed that the skinny kid who'd shared his last cigarette with you in a Belgian foxhole had become a grandfather with bad knees and reading glasses. The years had changed your faces, but not your bonds. You could still read each other's expressions, still finish each other's war stories. The younger generations at these reunions, the sons and daughters and grandchildren, would listen with a mixture of pride and incomprehension. They'd heard fragments of stories over the years, sanitized versions that left out the worst parts. Now they were getting the real accounts, the ones their fathers and grandfathers had finally decided they were ready to hear. Some of the stories were funny in retrospect. The time your entire squad got drunk on liberated German snaps and had to fight off a hangover while under artillery bombardment. The French farmer who insisted on cooking dinner for your platoon while mortar rounds were landing in his barnyard. The German soldier who surrendered because he'd run out of ammunition and wanted to borrow some bullets so he could keep fighting fairly. Other stories were harder to tell. The medic who died trying to save a German soldier. The civilian family you'd found in the rubble of their home, still clutching each other. The moment you realized you'd killed someone young enough to be your little brother, wearing a uniform that might as well have been a costume for all the protection it offered. You talked about the sounds that stayed with you, Not just the obvious ones like artillery and machine guns, but the quieter sounds that haunted you more. The way wounded men called for their mothers in languages you didn't understand. The silence that fell over a battlefield when the shooting stopped and you could hear birds singing in the distance. The crunch of broken glass under boots in cities that had been beautiful once. The smells were worse than the sounds. Cordite and death became so familiar you stopped noticing them, which was almost more disturbing than the initial shock. The sweet, cloying smell of bodies left too long in the sun. The acrid smoke from burning tanks, with their crews still inside. The particular scent of fear, sweat that every soldier learned to recognize on himself and others. You talked about the small kindnesses that kept you human. The sergeant who shared his coffee with you when you'd lost everything in a shelling. The French resistance fighter who risked her life to guide your unit through enemy territory. The German grandmother who gave you directions to the nearest aid station after you'd been wounded, speaking in broken English and looking at you with the same worried expression your own grandmother might have worn. These reunions became rituals, annual pilgrimages to a shared past that was simultaneously the worst and most meaningful experience of your lives. You'd complain about the hotel food, joke about your medications, and wonder aloud how you'd all gotten so old so fast. But underneath the casual conversation was the acknowledgement that you'd been through something together that no one else could fully understand. The wives and husbands of veterans developed their own informal network, sharing strategies for dealing with nightmares, sudden mood changes, and the peculiar way their spouses would sometimes disappear into memories without warning. They'd learned to recognize the signs, to know when to offer comfort and when to give space, to understand that some battles continued long after the war ended. Your own family learned to navigate around the invisible boundaries your war experience had created. They knew not to sneak up on you when you were dozing. They understood why crowded places sometimes made you nervous, why you always preferred to sit facing the door, why certain movies or television shows would make you leave the room without explanation. The grandchildren were different. They asked direct questions with the fearless curiosity of youth. Did you kill people? Grandpa, were you scared? What did the bombs sound like? Their innocent directness sometimes got answers that decades of careful family diplomacy hadn't managed to extract. You found yourself wanting to tell them everything, to pass on not just the facts but the lessons. That courage wasn't about not being afraid, but about acting despite fear. That heroes were mostly ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and somehow didn't run. That war was both the worst thing humans could do to each other, and sometimes the only way to stop something even worse. But you also wanted to protect them from too much knowledge too soon. There were things children shouldn't have to think about. Realities that could wait until they were old enough to understand that the world was complicated, and that sometimes good people had to do terrible things for necessary reasons. The medals and commendations you'd earned meant more to other people than they did to you. Purple hearts for wounds that had healed decades ago. Bronze stars for actions you barely remembered. Campaign ribbons that marked places and times you'd rather forget. Your family displayed them proudly. You kept them in a drawer, understanding their significance, but knowing that the real prizes were the men who'd come home alive. Some of your unit hadn't been as fortunate. Their names were carved in stone in cemeteries across Europe and America, permanently young, frozen forever at the age they'd been when the shooting stopped for them. You visited these graves when you could, leaving small tokens and spending quiet moments remembering voices that existed now only in the memories of survivors. The guilt of survival was something therapists had names for, but couldn't really cure. Why you when so many others didn't make it? Why did the bullet miss you and hit the guy standing 3 feet away? Why did you step left when stepping right would have put you on the landmine? These questions had no satisfactory answers, only the gradual acceptance that randomness was part of war's equation. You learned to carry the weight of their absence without letting it crush you. To live not just for yourself, but as a representative of all the futures they'd never have. To make your survival mean something by building a life worthy of the sacrifice they'd made. To remember them not as victims, but as young men who'd answered when their country called and paid the ultimate price for that answer. The changing world brought new conflicts, new generations of soldiers, new versions of the same old story of young people being asked to risk everything for causes larger than themselves. You watched the Vietnam War with a mixture of understanding and frustration, seeing your own experience reflected in the faces of soldiers fighting in jungles instead of fields, but facing the same basic challenges of survival, mission, and brotherhood. The protests and social upheaval of the 1960s were particularly difficult. Part of you understood the anti-war sentiment, had seen enough combat to know that war should be avoided whenever possible. But another part of you was offended by the casual dismissal of military service, the assumption that everyone who wore a uniform was automatically complicit in immoral actions. You tried to explain to anyone who would listen that most soldiers weren't warmongers or political ideologues. They were kids who'd been asked to serve and had done so, often at considerable personal cost. The decision to go to war was made by politicians and generals. The decision to serve honorably, once there was made by individual soldiers who deserved respect regardless of anyone's opinion about the war itself. Vietnam veterans faced challenges you'd been spared. They came home to a country that seemed ashamed of them, that treated military service as something embarrassing rather than honorable. You made efforts to welcome them into veteran organizations, to share the hard-won knowledge that adjustment took time, that the nightmares eventually became manageable, that civilian life could be rebuilt even when it felt impossible. The Cold War created its own kind of tension, a constant low-level awareness that the peace you'd fought for was fragile and temporary. Nuclear weapons changed the entire calculation of warfare, making total victory impossible and total destruction always possible. You understood that your children were growing up under a sword of Damocles that made your wartime fears look simple by comparison. As the decades passed, you watched America change in ways both encouraging and troubling. The civil rights movement reminded you of the segregated units you'd served alongside, good soldiers who'd been denied opportunities because of their race. The women's liberation movement made you think of the nurses and resistance fighters you'd known, women who'd shown as much courage as any man, but had been largely forgotten in the official histories. Technology advanced at a pace that made your wartime experience seem ancient. Jet aircraft replaced the prop planes you'd watched dogfight overhead. Guided missiles replaced the artillery that had terrorized your foxholes. Communications improved to the point where soldiers could talk to their families from halfway around the world, a luxury that would have seemed miraculous when your only contact with home was letters that took weeks to arrive. But underneath all the technological advancement, you recognized that the fundamental experience of combat remained the same. Young people still faced the same fears, made the same sacrifices, formed the same bonds under fire. The weapons were more sophisticated, but the human cost remained as high as ever. You began to see yourself as part of history, rather than just a participant in it. Museums wanted your uniform, your letters, your personal accounts of events that had shaped the modern world. Schools invited you to speak to students who had trouble imagining a world without computers, cell phones, and global instant communication. These speaking engagements were both rewarding and challenging. You wanted to convey not just the facts of what had happened, but the human reality behind the historical events. To help young people understand that the men who'd stormed the beaches and liberated the camps were once their age, with similar hopes and fears and uncertainties about the future. You struggled with how much reality to share with audiences who'd never experienced anything more traumatic than a difficult exam or a broken relationship. How do you explain the weight of a dead friend without traumatizing children? How do you convey the horror of combat without glorifying violence? How do you honor the sacrifice without encouraging future wars? The answer, you discovered, was to focus on the human elements rather than the technical details, to talk about friendship, loyalty, courage, and sacrifice rather than weapons and tactics. To emphasize that war was something that happened to ordinary people, not something that only happened to heroes or villains. Your own mortality became more real as friends from your unit began dying from the diseases and infirmities of old age. Heart attacks, cancer, strokes. The natural enemies that no amount of combat experience could prepare you to fight. Each funeral was a reminder that you were part of a generation that was disappearing, taking with it first-hand knowledge of events that had shaped the world. You began to feel a sense of urgency about preserving not just the facts of your experience, but the lessons you'd learned. The importance of preparation, training and equipment, but also the greater importance of leadership, teamwork, and moral courage. The understanding that freedom wasn't free, that democracy required citizens willing to defend it, that peace was something that had to be actively maintained rather than passively enjoyed. The realization came gradually that you'd lived through one of the defining periods of human history, that the war you'd helped fight had determined not just the political boundaries of nations, but the moral trajectory of civilization, that the evil you'd helped defeat represented something that could emerge again if people weren't vigilant, weren't willing to recognize and resist it before it became too powerful to stop. You'd started as a young man who thought he knew what he was getting into and discovered that no one really knows what war is like until they've been there. You'd learned that courage came in many forms, that heroism was often accidental, that the most important battles were sometimes fought not with weapons, but with the simple decision to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. The boy who'd walked into that recruitment office had been motivated by abstract concepts of duty and patriotism. The man who'd walked out of the war understood that duty meant taking care of the person next to you, and patriotism meant being willing to sacrifice for something larger than yourself, even when you weren't sure exactly what that something was. You'd seen the best and worst of humanity, often in the same day, sometimes in the same person. You'd learned that people were capable of incredible cruelty and incredible kindness, that circumstances could turn ordinary individuals into monsters or saints, that the line between civilization and barbarism was thinner than most people wanted to believe. Most importantly, you'd learned that it was possible to survive experiences that seemed unsurvivable, to rebuild a life after it had been completely destroyed, to find meaning and purpose even after witnessing meaninglessness and waste. You'd learned that resilience wasn't just about physical toughness, but about the ability to adapt, to find reasons to keep living when death would have been easier. The war had ended more than half a century ago, but its influence continued to shape every day of your life. In the way you approached problems, the way you valued relationships, the way you understood the fragility and preciousness of ordinary peaceful moments. You'd been changed by the experience in ways both visible and invisible, scarred, but also strengthened. As you approached the end of your own life, you realized that the war had given you something valuable, despite all its costs. It had taught you what really mattered, what was worth fighting for, what was worth preserving. It had shown you that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when everything they cared about was at stake. You'd helped save the world, not through any single heroic action, but through the collective effort of millions of people who'd been willing to risk everything for the chance to build something better. You'd been part of something larger than yourself, something that had mattered in ways that transcended individual survival or personal glory. The brutal life of a World War II soldier had been exactly that, brutal in ways that had marked you forever. But it had also been meaningful, necessary, and ultimately successful in ways that justified the sacrifice. You'd helped create a world where your grandchildren could grow up free, where they could take democracy for granted, because you'd helped ensure they'd never have to fight for it themselves. That was your legacy, your contribution, your answer to the question of whether it had all been worth it. The freedom to complain about politicians, to protest wars, to live ordinary lives in extraordinary safety, all of it paid for by people who'd been willing to give up their youth, their innocence, and sometimes their lives to make it possible. You'd survived not just the war, but the peace that followed. You'd learned to live with the memories, to carry the scars without being defined by them, to find purpose in preservation and remembrance. You'd become a bridge between a world that had faced its greatest test and a world that had inherited the peace that victory had made possible. And in the end, that was enough.